The book of Joel, traditionally attributed to the prophet Joel, is situated among the minor prophets of the Old Testament. While its exact dating is debated, scholars place it between the 9th and 5th centuries BCE, possibly during or after the Babylonian exile. The book addresses a series of crises: locust plagues, drought, and impending divine judgment, calling Israel to repentance and promising restoration. Joel 3, the culminating chapter, shifts focus to a future event known as the Day of the Lord, a time when God will intervene decisively in human history. In Joel 3 verse 1-2, we read, "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there. On behalf of my people, the day of the Lord is a recurring motif in prophetic literature, representing a time of divine reckoning and restoration. For Christians, this concept extends into the New Testament, where it is associated with the second coming of Christ. No nation, regardless of its power, is beyond his judgment. The nations are judged for scattering Israel and dividing their land, acts that violate God's promise to Abraham. The restoration of Judah and Jerusalem points to God's redemptive plan, fulfilled partially in Israel's historical return from exile, and ultimately in the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. This aligns with Matthew 25 verse 40, where Jesus teaches that how people treat the least of these reflects the relationship with him. The Valley of Jehoshaphat, therefore, serves as a reminder of moral accountability before God. Revelation 21 verse 1-4 envisions this as the new heaven and new earth, where God dwells with his people. The judgment in Joel 3 may represent ongoing divine judgment throughout history or a final judgment at Christ's return. This perspective emphasizes spiritual rather than literal fulfillment. For Christians, this underscores God's unwavering commitment to his people. Both Israel, the events of Joel 3, may be seen as challenges that precede this era of righteousness, and the church, which is seen as the spiritual heir of God's promises. As Jesus himself cautioned in Matthew 24 verse 36, "But concerning that day, an hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." Christians are called to remain vigilant and faithful, trusting in God's ultimate plan. This resonates with Psalm 2 verse 1-4, where God laughs at the nation's futile plots against him, asserting his ultimate control. As we explore these profound truths, consider diving deeper into Scripture and its relevance to our world. If you find this exploration of biblical prophecy and its connection to contemporary events thought-provoking, I invite you to join our community of learners and seekers. By subscribing to our channel, you'll gain access to ongoing discussions, insightful analyses, and resources that bridge ancient texts with modern challenges. Your engagement helps us continue to provide meaningful content that inspires faith and understanding. Together, let's seek wisdom and discernment in these complex times, trusting in the God who holds all history in his hands. Premillennialists often see the conflicts described in Joel 3 as precursors to the Battle of Armageddon, where nations gather against Israel, leading to Christ's victorious return. Current events, such as tensions in the Middle East, may be interpreted as signs of this impending conflict, as seen in Matthew 25 verse 31-46, where Jesus describes the judgment of the nations as a separation of sheep and goats. "And my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations, and have divided up my land." The term Valley of Jehoshaphat is significant. The name Jehoshaphat translates to Yahweh judges, suggesting that this valley symbolizes divine judgment rather than a specific geographical location. Some scholars propose it may refer to the Kedron Valley near Jerusalem, but most interpret it as a theological construct, a place where God executes justice. The passage emphasizes God's role as the ultimate judge, holding nations accountable for their treatment of Israel, his chosen people. This theme of divine justice is echoed in other prophetic texts, such as Zechariah 14 verse 1-5, which describes a gathering of nations against Jerusalem, followed by God's intervention. Later, in Joel 3 verse 12-14, the valley is also called Valley of Decision, where God declares, "Let the nations stir themselves up and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision." This imagery underscores the universality of God's judgment, encompassing all nations. From a Christian theological perspective, Joel 3 highlights several key themes. 1. God's sovereignty. The gathering of nations in the valley of Jehoshaphat affirms God's authority over all peoples and history. 2. Covenantal faithfulness. God's judgment in Joel 3 is tied to his covenant with Israel. 3. Eschatological hope. Joel 3 offers hope amidst judgment. 4. Moral accountability. The judgment of the nations is based on their actions, particularly their hostility toward Israel. Christian interpretations of Joel 3 vary across eschatological frameworks. Premillennialism. This view holds that Christ will return before a literal 1,000-year reign on earth. Amillennialism. Amillennialists view the 1,000 years as symbolic of Christ's current reign through the church. Postmillennialism. This view posits that the gospel will gradually transform the world, leading to a period of peace before Christ's return. These diverse perspectives encourage humility in interpreting prophetic texts. The message of Joel 3 is not merely a distant prophecy, but a call to reflection and action. The prophetic vision of the Valley of Jehoshaphat in Joel 3, where God gathers the nations for judgment, draws deeply from the historical and cultural context of ancient Israel. To understand this imagery, we must explore the historical events surrounding King Jehoshaphat's reign recorded in 2 Chronicles 20 verse 1-30. Jehoshaphat faced a formidable coalition of Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites who united to invade Judah. Overwhelmed by the threat, Jehoshaphat turned to God in prayer, leading his people in a collective plea for divine intervention. This event, described in 2 Kings 25 verse 1-21, fulfilled earlier prophetic warnings about Israel's disobedience. This restoration, detailed in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, involved rebuilding the temple and re-establishing worship in Jerusalem. Joel 3 verse 1 speaks of this hope. "For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem." In ancient Near Eastern context, dividing a conquered land was a common practice, as seen in the actions of Babylon and later empires like Assyria. The prophet Joel frames this as an offense against God's covenant, as the land of Israel was seen as God's inheritance, promised to Abraham his descendants in Genesis 15 verse 18-21. The historical victory of Jehoshaphat, the trauma of exile, and the hope of restoration all inform the vision of the Valley of Jehoshaphat as a place of divine judgment and vindication. While these events are rooted in Israel's past, they carry universal significance, pointing to a future where God's justice prevails. As we consider this imagery, we are reminded of Psalm 46 verse 10, where God declares, "Be still, and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." This assurance invites us to trust in God's sovereignty, even amidst the complexities of history and prophecy. The imagery of nations being judged for this act connects historical realities to the theological assertion that God will hold nations accountable for violating his covenantal promises. A historical return from exile serves as a tangible example of God's faithfulness, reinforcing the prophetic expectation that he will ultimately gather his people and judge those who oppose them. The victory of Jehoshaphat prefigures the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom, as described in Revelation 19 verse 11-21, where Christ defeats the forces arrayed against him. Similarly, The exile and return from Babylon symbolize the broader biblical narrative of fall and redemption, culminating in the New Testament as promise of a new heaven and new earth in Revelation 21 verse 1-4. For Christians, the imagery of Joel 3 points to both historical fulfillments and future expectations, inviting reflection on God's ongoing work in history. This cycle of judgment, exile, and restoration in Israel as history provides a framework for understanding Joel as imagery as both rooted in historical reality and pointing to a future divine act. As seen in Jeremiah 25 verse 8-11, the victory of Jehoshaphat illustrates God's ability to defeat overwhelming enemies without human effort, a theme that resonates with the apocalyptic imagery of awe. Joel 3 verse 12-14, where God sits in judgment over the nations in the Valley of Decision. The term Valley of Decision suggests a moment of divine reckoning, where the fate of nations is determined based on their actions toward Israel. This imagery draws on the historical memory of God's interventions, such as in Jehoshaphat's time, to convey the certainty of divine justice. The exile involved the scattering of God's people among the nations, a tragedy reflected in Joel 3 verse 2, where God judges the nations because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided up my land. The exile was a period of profound suffering as the Israelites lost their temple, their capital, and their autonomy. However, it also set the stage for God's promise of restoration, a key theme in Joel's prophecy. God responded through the prophet Jehaziel, assuring Judah that the battle belonged to the Lord. Remarkably, as the Judahites worshipped, God caused confusion among their enemies, leading the Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites to turn on each other and destroy themselves. Jehoshaphat and his people emerged victorious without striking a blow, and the valley where this occurred was called the Valley of Barakah, meaning blessing, as a testament to God's deliverance. And other significant moments in Israel's past, such as the Babylonian exile and the return from captivity. The name Jehoshaphat, meaning Yahweh judges, aligns with the theme of divine judgment in Joel 3 verse 2, where God declares, "I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel." While the valley of Jehoshaphat in Joel is not explicitly identified as a physical location, the historical victory under King Jehoshaphat serves as a type or foreshadowing of the ultimate divine judgment. The historical event demonstrates God's sovereignty over hostile nations. A theme echoed in Joel is vision of a future gathering of nations for judgment due to their mistreatment of Israel. These events provide a foundation for the symbolic language used in Joel's prophecy, offering a lens through which we can interpret its significance. By examining these historical moments, we uncover how they shape the prophetic imagery of divine judgment and restoration, connecting ancient narratives to the theological themes that resonate with contemporary audiences. The story of King Jehoshaphat, a ruler of Judah in the 9th century BCE, is central to understanding the imagery of the Valley of Jehoshaphat. This historical event is significant for the prophecy in Joel 3 because it illustrates God's power to intervene decisively on behalf of his people. Another critical historical context is the Babylonian exile, which began in 586 BCE when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, destroyed Jerusalem and deported much of Judah's population. The return from Babylonian captivity, beginning in 538 BCE under the decree of Cyrus the Persian, as recorded in Ezra 1 verse 1-4, marked a partial fulfillment of God's promise to restore Judah and Jerusalem. The prophetic imagery in Joel 3 is enriched by these historical events, which serve as archetypes for the eschatological vision. Moreover, the scattering of Israel during the Babylonian exile informs the prophetic accusation in Joel 3 that the nations have divided up my land. These historical events also carry symbolic weight in Christian theology. The connection between ancient history and Joel's prophetic imagery underscores the continuity of God's plan. The prophetic vision in Joel 3 of the gathering of nations in the valley of Jehoshaphat for divine judgment resonates with contemporary events, particularly the escalating conflicts involving Israel in 2025. The year has been marked by significant tensions in the Middle East, with Israel at the center of military engagements, diplomatic disputes, and global attention. This operation targeted Iran's nuclear facilities, military infrastructure, and key regime assets, escalating a long-standing rivalry into open conflict. In March 2025, Israel launched significant military operations in Gaza City. Iran's alliances with Russia and China, coupled with the United States' support for Israel, create a polarized global environment. European nations, while advocating for de-escalation, are divided on their approach, with some supporting Israel's right to self-defense and others criticizing its military actions. This global polarization recalls the imagery of Joel 3 verse 12, where God calls the nations to stir themselves up and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat for judgment. In a modern context, this raises questions about the international community's treatment of Israel, whether through diplomatic isolation, economic sanctions, or support for opposing factions. Jesus' warning in Matthew 24 verse 36, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son," and Hezbollah resonate with the themes of Joel 3, evoking images of nations gathering for judgment. While these events do not necessarily fulfill the prophecy, they reflect its enduring relevance, prompting Christians to consider God's justice, sovereignty, and faithfulness. As we reflect on these modern challenges, we are called to trust in God's plan, seek discernment, and live faithfully, knowing that He holds the future, as affirmed in Revelation 22 verse 20, where Jesus declares, "Surely I am coming soon." But the Father only serves as a reminder that Christians should approach such events with caution, avoiding definitive claims about their role in end-time scenarios. Instead, the conflicts of 2025 invite reflection on God's sovereignty and His call to faithfulness. As believers navigate these turbulent times, they are encouraged to seek wisdom through prayer and Scripture, trusting that God's purposes will prevail. As promised in Isaiah 46 verse 10, where God declares, "My purpose shall stand, and I will do all that I please." While Joel's prophecy is rooted in God's covenant with Israel, Christians also see a broader principle of justice where God holds all nations accountable for their actions, as reflected in Matthew 25 verse 31 to 46, where Jesus judges the nations based on their treatment of the least of these. This call to justice challenges believers to advocate for fairness and compassion in a world marked by conflict. The involvement of major powers in the Middle East, whether through direct intervention, arms supplies, or diplomatic maneuvers, suggests a convergence of international forces that could align with the prophetic vision of a gathering of nations. While these events do not necessarily constitute a direct fulfillment of Joel's prophecy, they evoke its themes, prompting reflection on their theological implications. They challenge Christians to consider their response to global crises in light of biblical teachings. Jesus' words in Matthew 24, verse 6 to 8, where He speaks of wars and rumors of wars as the beginning of birth pains, encourage believers to remain steadfast amid turmoil, trusting in God's ultimate plan. The conflicts of 2025, while alarming, serve as a reminder of the transient nature of human kingdoms and the enduring sovereignty of God, as affirmed in Daniel 2 verse 44, where God's kingdom shall never be destroyed. This perspective fosters hope, urging believers to focus on prayer, discernment, and faithfulness rather than speculation about the timing of eschatological events. The current conflicts, particularly the targeting of Israel by Iran and its proxies, can be seen as a modern parallel to the historical hostility faced by Israel, as described in Psalm 83 verse 1 to 5, where nations conspire against your people and seek to wipe them out as a nation. For many Christians, especially those with a premillennial eschatological perspective, these events may be interpreted as signs of the approaching Day of the Lord, a time of divine intervention and judgment. However, other theological perspectives, such as amillennialism, caution against equating specific modern events with prophetic fulfillment, viewing them instead as part of God's ongoing work in history. These operations have resulted in significant casualties and infrastructure damage, drawing widespread international scrutiny. Israel's military presence has also expanded into the West Bank, where clashes with Palestinian groups have escalated, and into southern Lebanon, where confrontations with Hezbollah have intensified. These multi-front conflicts reflect the historical pattern of Israel facing opposition from surrounding nations, a theme central to Joel 3 verse 2, where God judges the nations for scattering his people and dividing his land. The division of land, a key grievance in Joel's prophecy, resonates with ongoing disputes over territorial control in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where competing claims to the land remain a flashpoint. Iran, a regional power with a history of hostility toward Israel, has supported proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, creating a multifaceted threat. The strike has heightened tensions, drawing international responses from major powers. The United States, a steadfast ally of Israel, has provided diplomatic and military support, while Russia and China, aligned with Iran, have condemned the action and signaled potential countermeasures. This convergence of global powers around a regional conflict evokes the imagery of Joel 3 verse 2, where God gathers all the nations to the valley of Jehoshaphat to judge them for their actions against Israel. The involvement of diverse nations in this crisis suggests a scenario where global alliances could align against Israel, mirroring the prophetic gathering described in the text. These conflicts, involving Iran, the Palestinian territories, and regional actors like Hezbollah, raise questions about their potential alignment with biblical prophecies. By examining these modern conflicts and their broader implications, we can explore how they reflect themes of divine justice, national accountability, and the enduring relevance of Joel's prophecy in Christian theology, while remaining cautious about definitive eschatological interpretations. One of the most significant events of 2025 is Israel's military strike on Iran, launched on June 13th. The ongoing conflict in the Palestinian territories, particularly in Gaza, further intensifies the regional landscape. The international dimension of these conflicts adds another layer of significance. From a Christian theological perspective, these conflicts highlight the themes of divine justice and accountability central to Joel 3. The significance of these conflicts extends beyond their immediate geopolitical impact. Moreover, the conflicts underscore the moral accountability emphasized in Joel 3. The nations are judged for their actions against Israel, particularly for scattering its people and dividing its land. The complexity of these conflicts also highlights the need for humility in interpreting their prophetic significance. In conclusion, the conflicts of 2025, particularly Israel's confrontations with Iran, Palestinian groups, the vision of the valley of Jehoshaphat in Joel 3, where God gathers the nations for judgment, holds profound significance within Christian eschatology, the study of end times events. This prophetic imagery, depicting divine justice and the restoration of Israel, has been interpreted through various theological lenses, each offering distinct perspectives on how and when these events might unfold. In the context of modern conflicts in 2025, particularly those involving Israel, these eschatological frameworks provide a way to understand the potential connections between current events and biblical prophecy. For amillennialists, the judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat, described in Joel 3 verse the 12th to the 14th of May, not point to a single future event, but rather to God's ongoing judgment throughout history, or a final judgment at the end of time. Premillennialists may see the conflicts of 2025 as signs of an approaching end, prompting urgency in preparing for Christ's return. Amillennialists, however, encourage a focus on God's present reign, viewing these events as part of his ongoing work in history. Postmillennialists find hope in the potential for transformation, seeing current challenges as opportunities for the gospel to prevail. Despite these differences, all perspectives affirm the central themes of Joel 3: God's sovereignty, his commitment to his people, and his ultimate justice. The imagery of the Valley of Jehoshaphat serves as a reminder that God holds nations accountable, as reiterated in Psalm 96 verse 13, where he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the peoples in his faithfulness. The imagery of nations gathered for judgment reflects God's continual sovereignty over human affairs, as seen in Psalm 9 verse 7 to 8, where God has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness. Jesus' warning in Matthew 24 verse 36, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only," urges caution in linking specific events to prophetic fulfillment. The tensions of 2025, while significant, are part of a larger divine narrative that culminates in God's victory, as promised in Revelation 22 verse 20, where Jesus declares, "Surely I am coming soon." Whether viewed as signs of the end, part of ongoing history, or challenges preceding renewal, these events call believers to trust in God's sovereignty, seek his guidance, and live out the gospel in a world marked by uncertainty. While the conflicts involving Israel, Iran, and other regional actors evoke the imagery of nations gathering against God's people, Christians are called to avoid dogmatic assertions about the timing or nature of these events. Instead, the prophecy invites reflection on God's character and purposes. The promise of restoration in Joel 3 verse 1 offers hope that God will fulfill his covenant, while the judgment of the nations underscores his justice. As affirmed in Isaiah 2 verse 4, where God shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples. In this view, the conflicts of 2025 are significant but not necessarily direct fulfillments of Joel's prophecy. Instead, they are part of the broader pattern of human rebellion and divine correction that characterizes history. Amillennialists caution against tying specific geopolitical events to end-time scenarios, emphasizing the spiritual significance of Joel's message. The restoration of Israel in Joel 3 may be understood as fulfilled in the spiritual inclusion of both Jews and Gentiles in the church, as described in Romans 11 verse 25 to 26, where Paul speaks of all Israel being saved. This perspective encouraged believers to focus on living faithfully in the present, trusting in God's ultimate victory, without speculating about the timing of eschatological events. By exploring the premillennial, amillennial, and postmillennial perspectives, we can gain insight into the diverse ways Christians interpret Joel 3, while recognizing the need for humility in applying ancient prophecies to contemporary realities. In this view, the judgment of the nations in Joel 3 could represent challenges or opposition that precede this era of global renewal. The conflicts of 2025, while troubling, might be seen as part of the birth pains described in Matthew 24, verse 6 to 8, where Jesus speaks of wars and turmoil as precursors to greater redemption. Postmillennialists interpret the restoration of Judah and Jerusalem in Joel 3 verse 1 as a symbol of God's broader plan to bless all nations through the spread of the gospel, as promised in Genesis 12 verse 3, where God tells Abraham, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." The current Middle East conflicts, therefore, are viewed as temporary obstacles that will ultimately give way to a period of spiritual and societal flourishing. This perspective emphasizes the Church's role in promoting justice, peace, and reconciliation, trusting that God's kingdom will advance through human faithfulness. Premillennialism is a widely held eschatological view that anticipates the literal return of Jesus Christ before a 1,000-year reign on earth. as described in Revelation 20 verse 1 to 6. In this framework, the gathering of nations in the valley of Jehoshaphat, as foretold in Joel 3 verse 2, is often seen as a precursor to the climactic battle of Armageddon, described in Revelation 16 verse 12 to 16. Premillennialists interpret the conflicts of 2025, such as Israel's military actions against Iran and ongoing tensions in Gaza and Lebanon, as potential signs of the end times. The convergence of global powers Israel, supported by the United States, and Iran backed by Russia and China mirrors the prophetic imagery of nations assembling against Israel. For premillennialists, these events could signal the approach of the day of the Lord, a time when God intervenes to judge the nations and restore his people. The emphasis on Israel's restoration in Joel 3 verse 1, "When I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem," aligns with the belief in a future regathering of Israel, followed by Christ's return to establish his kingdom. This perspective sees the current Middle East conflicts as part of a larger eschatological timeline, culminating in divine victory and the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. In contrast, amillennialism offers a symbolic interpretation of the 1,000-year reign, viewing it as representing Christ's current spiritual reign through the church, rather than a literal future period. Postmillennialism presents a third perspective, positing that the gospel will gradually transform the world, leading to a period of peace and righteousness before Christ's return. Each of these eschatological perspectives shapes how Christians interpret the relevance of Joel 3 to modern events. The complexity of applying Joel 3 to 2025 underscores the need for theological humility. Ultimately, the eschatological perspectives on Joel 3 encourage Christians to respond to modern conflicts with faith, prayer, and discernment. The prophetic vision of the Valley of Jehoshaphat in Joel 3, where God gathers the nations for judgment and restores his people, offers a powerful lens through which to view both ancient history and contemporary events. As we consider the conflicts of 2025, particularly those involving Israel, Iran's support for proxy groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, combined with Israel's military responses, has drawn international attention and involvement, creating a polarized global landscape. Jesus' words in Matthew 24 verse 36, "But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only," caution against definitive claims about the timing or fulfillment of end times events. The restoration promised in Joel 3 verse 1 points to God's redemptive plan, which transcends temporal conflicts and culminates in the establishment of his eternal kingdom, and restores his people, resonates with the conflicts of 2025, particularly Israel's tensions with Iran and in Gaza. These events echo the prophecy's themes of divine justice and covenantal faithfulness, as seen in Joel 3 verse 2, where God gathers nations for judgment. While these conflicts evoke the imagery of nations opposing Israel, Jesus' words in Matthew 24 verse 36 remind us to approach such connections with humility, as only God knows the timing of his plan. The promise of restoration in Joel 3 verse 1 offers hope, pointing to God's ultimate victory, as affirmed in Revelation 22 verse 20, "Surely I am coming soon." Christians are called to respond with prayer, faith, and trust in God's sovereignty. As Psalm 46 verse 10 declares, "Be still and know that I am God." This hope is echoed in Revelation 22 verse 20, where Jesus declares, "Surely I am coming soon." Join us as we seek wisdom and understanding in these challenging times. For Christians, this promise inspires steadfastness, encouraging them to remain vigilant and faithful, as urged in Matthew 24 verse 42. "Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming." The conflicts of 2025, while significant, are part of a larger divine narrative that will ultimately lead to God's victory and the renewal of all things. While the conflicts of 2025 may evoke the imagery of Joel's prophecy, Christians are called to avoid speculative assertions and instead focus on living faithfully in the present. The promise of restoration in Joel 3 verse 1, "When I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem," offers hope that God will fulfill his covenant promises. Whether through historical events like the return from Babylonian exile or in the ultimate establishment of his kingdom, as described in Revelation 21 verse 1 to 4, this hope encourages believers to trust in God's plan, even amidst global turmoil. This mirrors the imagery of nations being judged for scattering Israel and dividing its land, as seen in Joel 3 verse 2. The territorial disputes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank, further resonate with the prophetic accusation of dividing God's land. These modern challenges recall Psalm 83 verse 1 to 5, where nations conspire to wipe them out as a nation, yet God's sovereignty remains unshaken. For Christians, these events serve as a call to prayer and discernment, recognizing that God's purposes extend beyond human conflicts, as affirmed in Isaiah 46 verse 10, where he declares, "My purpose shall stand, and I will do all that I please." And the Palestinian territories, the themes of divine justice, covenantal faithfulness, and ultimate restoration resonate deeply within Christian theology. These modern tensions, while complex and multifaceted, invite reflection on the enduring relevance of Joel's prophecy and its call to trust in God as sovereignty. The judgment of the nations in the valley of Jehoshaphat reflects his commitment to defend his people and uphold justice, as seen in Psalm 9 verse 7 to 8, where he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the peoples with uprightness. For Christians, this extends to the New Testament, where Jesus teaches in Matthew 25 verse 31 to 46 that nations will be judged based on their treatment of the least of these. The conflicts of 2025 challenge believers to consider their role in promoting justice, compassion, and reconciliation in a divided world. While geopolitical tensions may seem overwhelming, they also present opportunities to reflect God's love and truth, trusting that he is working out his purposes. By exploring the theological, historical, and eschatological dimensions of this text, we can draw meaningful conclusions about its significance and respond with humility, faith, and hope in a world marked by uncertainty. Joel 3 presents a vivid picture of God's intervention in human history, as seen in Joel 3 verse 2, where he declares, "I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided up my land." This passage underscores God's commitment to his covenant people and his authority to hold nations accountable for their actions. The imagery of the Valley of Jehoshaphat, whether a literal or symbolic place, serves as a reminder that God's justice is universal and inevitable. In the context of 2025, the conflicts surrounding Israel, particularly the military strike against Iran on June 13th, and the ongoing operations in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon echo the prophetic theme of nations gathering against God's people. These events, involving global powers such as the United States, Russia, and China, evoke the idea of a convergence of nations, as described in Joel's vision. While these conflicts do not necessarily fulfill the prophecy, they highlight its relevance, prompting Christians to consider how God's justice and faithfulness might be at work in today's world. The conflicts of 2025, particularly Israel's confrontation with Iran, reflect the historical pattern of opposition to God's people, a theme central to Joel 3. Reflecting on these events through the lens of Joel 3 also highlights the importance of humility in interpreting prophecy. Theologically, Joel 3 emphasizes God's covenantal faithfulness and his role as the ultimate judge. The enduring message of Joel 3 is one of hope and assurance. The vision of the Valley of Jehoshaphat in Joel 3, where God judges the nations. If this exploration of prophecy and current events inspires you, Subscribe to our channel for more insights connecting Scripture with today's world.